Alright, so, pardon me, I have my whiteboard out again, because I wanted to talk about something that's been kind of in the back of my head for a very long time. I actually tried to record this yesterday and I got my thoughts all jumbled up and I got rambly and I wasn't able to cram it all into 20 minutes. So I'm probably going to cut it into 2 videos, but it all boils down to a conversation I had with somebody that began with the question, do you believe in God? And I answered sorta, because I was raised in a Southern Baptist household and went to church and choir practice and all that falderall. But then I started having a really hard time internally when I started coming to terms with the fact that I was gay, because everything my religion was telling me that, I was going to go to hell. And I had to kind of cope with that and try to reconcile, what was going on in my head and what I was being taught and all of this, that, and the other thing. And what I ended up deciding on was that I could still believe in a higher intelligence, God, if you will, directing the design of the universe, but I simply couldn't believe in religion anymore, because I just couldn't agree with the fact that there are a bunch of hidebound, racist, old white men telling me what I can and cannot believe and do. So I ended up turning my back on religion, but I still wanted to sort of not consolidate, but I wanted to get, my belief in a higher power to agree with science. And I spent a long time thinking about it and trying to figure out how it would work. How could God or a higher intelligence exist as part of the universe? And how could I actually make it work within science? So in order to explain this, we're going to have to start exploring some multidimensional physics, because this is the way I've thought it through, and it makes a certain amount of sense, at least to me. The heck? Something on my desk just vibrated. I don't have anything over here that vibrates. What the heck? I'll figure out what that was later. Anyway, so we're going to exceed our standard 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional understanding of the universe, and we're actually going to go quite a few more dimensions up. So we're actually going to start at 0 dimensions, the 0th dimension. And 0 dimensions is going to be a dimension where there is no volume, there is no length, width, or depth. So it's just a point. Now, in geometry, we learned that we used points to dictate a location, but these locations did not have size or volume or anything. It was just a theoretical spot in existence. And, you could put a Cartesian coordinate system, like this, and then like this. And so that point would be, what, about 3, 3? So you'd mark it like that. And so that's your point. That's 0 dimensions. There's no depth, width, or height. It is just a theoretical location. Now, we can't interact with that. We can't measure it, we can't quantify it, we can't pick it up, we can't feel it or see it or look at it. So God certainly couldn't be a 0th dimensional being, because as we'll establish, you can't interact between dimensions. If you're a 3rd dimensional being, you can only interact in the 3rd dimension. You can't interact with the 4th or the 2nd dimension. So 0th dimension is out. Alright, so let's talk about actually I want to use the other pen because it's kind of a nice purpley color. So let's talk about the 1st dimension. So 1st dimension. What is the 1st dimension? Well, that's a line. Now that is a line with no volume, it has no width or depth, but it does have length, and technically this line would extend into infinity in all directions, some people are going to get pissed off at me about using negative infinity, but deal with it. So, and some people will say, well, you just created a one-dimensional thing. There it is, right there on the board. Well, no, this is actually a three-dimensional representation of a one-dimensional object, because although this seems one-dimensional because it's just a line, well, the line has thickness, so it's actually two-dimensional. It has area, and it also actually has volume, because the ink has a certain thickness. So we can't... This is actually a three-dimensional object right here. There's volume to this line. However infinitesimal, because the line of ink is only a couple of microns thick, but it's still three-dimensional. It's just a representation of a one-dimensional thing. So while we can discuss what a first-dimensional thing is, and theorize it, and set limits, so, what's that, about 4 inches, we can't actually interact with, create, or measure a real first-dimensional object, because it can't exist in our dimension. So God being a first-dimensional creature is, once again, out, because it wouldn't be able to affect the higher dimensions. So we're out on that one. So let's make that go away. Alright, now let's step up to the second dimension, right? So now we're going to add length and width. So let's draw a box. Now we have volume, because, or not volume, sorry, we have area, because it describes a, length and width, and you take, length and width and you multiply them and you get area, and, oops, let's shift that up a little bit. Right. So length times width, you get area, and, there we have 2 dimensions. But this still isn't 2 dimensions. Now I hear you asking the question, but isn't a piece of paper 2-dimensional? Nope, it's really not, because it still has volume, it still has a depth as well as its length and width. However, microscopic, even a piece of tracing paper has depth. There is a volume, a finite volume to a piece of paper, so it's not 2-dimensional. And once again, this is also not 2-dimensional, because even the ink has depth. So we can't interact with the second dimension thing. If God was second dimension, we still wouldn't, it wouldn't be able to interact, upwards to the second dimension or downwards to any of the other dimensions. And yes, I'm using it for God because some people think God is a she, some people think God is a he. I think, based on this theory that I've come up with, that God doesn't have a gender that we would be able to quantify. Alright, so now, I keep going off shot here. Third dimension. That is a horrible D. There, third dimension. Now, we need to add length, width, and depth. So, let's draw one of those lovely 2-dimensional representations of a cube that we've all seen in school, just like this. So, 3 dimensions. And in fact, I can even do us one better, and I'll just grab this box of resin. So now we're finally in our realm of existence. We're in the third dimension. Now we can pick up a third-dimensional object. I could reach over wherever they are and grab my calipers, and I could measure the dimensions of this, and then I could grab a scale and I could weigh it, and I could physically quantify and measure this object's existence, its reality, because it's right here. And so there is a minute possibility that God could be a third-dimensional being, but we would be able to measure or detect his existence, or its existence, because it would be in our dimensions. We'd be able to see it, we'd be able to measure it, quantify it, touch it, pick it up, whatever. So third dimension is pretty well out for the existence of God. Now, at this point, I'm going to cover the 3 traits of God, and this is very common across many religions. One is omnipotence, all-powerful. One is omniscience, all-knowing. And the third is not very commonly. Everybody is all about the omnipotence and the omniscience, but they always forget about omnipresence, being in all places and all times. So that's actually the one we're going to explore here, is the omnipresence, because I contend that without omnipresence you can't have omniscience or omnipotence. So we're going to throw omnipotence or omnipotence and omniscience out the window. We're going to disregard those for now, and we're just going to be talking about omnipresence, being in all places and all times. So can't really do that with the third dimensional being, because time, being in all times, time is our theoretical fourth dimension, at least as far as our quantum scientists theorize, because we can't interact with the fourth dimension. But it makes a certain amount of sense, and there's been a lot of much smarter people than me that have established that the fourth dimension is time. Now, I already hear you in the comments, so I'm gonna head you off right now. We don't interact with time. You may say, hey, we're traveling through time, so in some way we're acting through time. But we don't actually interact with time. Sure, we're traveling through it, but every actually, I'll go into a little bit more detail in a second here. So if we add another dimension to our third dimensional cube there, I'm not even going to try to draw it. There are, renderings out there of what a fourth dimensional cube would look like, and they're two-dimensional objects. And if I had a 3D printer, I'd 3D print a 3D representation of a fourth dimensional cube, because you can actually sort of get away with that. But a fourth dimensional cube actually has a name. They call it a tesseract. And a tesseract is a real science thing. It's a term that's been around for a lot longer than the Infinity Stones. So fourth dimension, which we would call time. Time. So you add a fourth dimension to that cube. Now you have length, width, depth, and duration. Duration may not be the best term for it, but we'll go with duration for the purposes of this discussion. Now, how does duration work for a cube? Well, let's say you have a 3D printer. I keep going off about 3D printers. I really need to buy myself another 3D printer if I ever get enough money. Anyway, so 3D printer. You decide to print a cube. Technically, that cube's duration starts at 0 from the moment you decide to print it, but for the sake of simplicity, we'll go with when the printer finishes. The print head pulls up, and the cube is finished. That cube's duration in fourth dimensional space now has started at 0 the moment that printer finishes. Now, 10 minutes later, you smash it apart with a hammer. The cube's duration in fourth dimensional space has now ended. But, we can't actually measure its fourth dimensional dimensions. We can't quantify them, we can't examine them, because we can't go back to when that cube first existed to measure it again. Like this, I can pick this back up, I can measure it from here to here. We can't measure that cube's length or duration in fourth dimensional space whenever we want, because it's already gone. So we can't interact with the fourth dimension. Some people might argue that our minds are fourth dimensional because we can remember past events, and you could probably make that argument, but it falls apart when you can't cast your mind forward. If you could cast your mind forward through time and remember future events, then your mind would actually be fourth dimensional. Now, I have 5 minutes to discuss what a fourth dimensional being would perceive to the third dimension as. Now, a fourth dimensional being can't actually interact with the third dimension, but it could theorize the existence of the third dimension, and to it, the third dimension would be what we would consider a two-dimensional area. but instead of length and width, what exactly? I figured out a way to describe third-dimensional space in a two-dimensional plane, and now I've completely blanked on it. I guess I remember position was one of them. I think it's, oh right, I decided that it would be position and volume, and then you'd, from a fourth dimensional perspective, the second dimension, which would be area, would actually appear as a line. And to a fourth dimensional being, if they were actually able to interact with the third dimension, which they wouldn't be, you could basically consider duration as, if this was an object that was a third-dimensional object in a fourth-dimensional space, you'd have duration, position and volume, and you could go backward and forward in time basically by traveling along its fourth-dimensional line in fourth-dimensional space. But you can't do that because, like the second dimension, a fourth-dimensional being would be unable to interact with an actual third-dimensional existence, because, like we can't interact with a second-dimensional item or object, because a second-dimensional object would not be able to exist within the constraints of our physics. So there's every possibility that a fourth-dimensional existence would have some sort of physics that would allow interaction with the third dimension, but it's not likely because we'd see evidence of a fourth dimensional being being able to interact with our universe. So it also completely negates the concept of omnipresence, because this plane that is the third dimension extends to infinity in all directions. And because of that extension into infinity, a fourth dimensional being would not be able to be present in all places and all times because of those infinity limits. So God can't be fourth dimensional. Now I'm going to stop at 4 dimensions because I only have 2 minutes left on the timer, and I don't want to stitch videos together because it takes forever because my computer's really starting to become a piece of crap. So, we'll have to finish this tomorrow. Bye-bye.